Right, so we are on Chav Tes Amud Aleph 29a. We come to the final comment of the Gemara on this section. Right, the Mishnah, you'll remember, had a list of laws that were derived on that day, the day that Rabbi Gamliel was deposed as the Nasi. Yeah, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah installed. And the first of those laws is the law of the Sotah, which we've been discussing over the last few days. And specifically, we've been discussing the halachic ramifications of her being declared a Sotah, namely that there is suspect that perhaps she was unfaithful behind closed doors before she drinks the Sotah waters, when we will determine her innocence or guilt. And all the four of the laws we derived essentially led us to conclude that Sveikai is like Vadai, namely that the doubt is as if it's an actual. We don't know what happened behind closed doors, so we cannot call her a definite Zoina if we know she was unfaithful, and she is a Zoina, the halachic qualification of the promiscuous woman. But in this case, we don't know yet. It's in doubt. Everything happened behind closed doors, which is why we're taking her to the temple to drink the waters to determine. But even until such time we determine, we still treat her halachically as if she did go through with that activity, and all the ramifications of that apply. Specifically for, and they are, that she cannot be with her husband. If her husband were to divorce her or die, she cannot be with the paramour. If she's the daughter of a kohen, and even if she was married to a kohen, she loses the kohanic privileges, and therefore she cannot eat from the truma. And number 4, if her husband died, she could not marry a kohen, even though ordinarily a widow can marry a kohen. In this instance, she can't because she's a Zona, even though we don't know that she was a Zona, but we treat the doubt as if it was an actual. So to this, the Gemara told us earlier, I'm going to pull it up on the page here. To this, the Gemara told us earlier that this serves as a foundation from which we derive the same law for the case of a doubt and impurity. 28.
If the husband, wait.
No, go ahead. What do you want to ask? 28b, sorry.
And I don't know, I didn't really develop the question very well.
Yeah, go ahead, go for it then.
If the husband died prior to her drinking, does the Sotah get called off?
If the husband dies, does she go to drinking? Yes, she does. She does not. Remember, we discussed that the qualification, one of the qualifying verses are that the husband has to bring her to the temple. Right. So if he's not there, the law goes off.
Right. So then that presumption sticks with her.
Yeah.
Even after he dies.
That's right. And after she dies, she cannot marry a kohen. That's the ramification.
Right, that's the ramification. But the Sotah proceeding, she's no longer.
The Sotah proceeding. So she's treated like a Zona.
How does that work? Yeah.
She's treated like a Zona even though we don't know even though we don't know if she's a Zona, she's treated like one.
Even though she's no longer a Sotah?
That's right. Okay. So from yeah?
Yeah.
So from here, from this notion that the doubt is considered an actual in the law of the Sotah, we derive the same thing for impurity. That when there's a doubt of impurity, we treat it as an actual. How did the Gemara derive that? The Gemara derived that from a kal v'chomer, from how much and the more so from Sotah. If a Sotah, which ordinarily, let's rephrase that. When it comes to infidelity, ordinarily, we are lenient on infidelity. If accidentally she was unfaithful, she thought she was with her husband, but she ended up being with someone else. or there was a rape, she was forced, then the laws of infidelity don't apply to her. And yet, the Sotah law tells us that if we are in doubt of her unfaithfulness, we treat her as if she was unfaithful. So even though we are lenient with respect to accidental or forced, we are strict with regard to doubt. Then when it comes to impurity, specifically the Gemara here discussed sheretz, when it comes to impurity, where we are more stringent ordinarily, we treat accidental as if it's impure. We treat force, if someone forcibly put impurity upon you, you're still impure, then how much more so we treat the doubt as an action. That's what the Gemara said. Now, considering that the law of the doubt by impurity is derived from the doubt of infidelity, the Sotah law, therefore we limited when we treat the doubt of impurity as an actual to the same instances when we would treat the doubt of infidelity as an actual. Specifically, two things. Number one, the only time doubtful infidelity becomes an actual, mainly the law of the Sotah, is when it's done in private, where there's only two people there, her and the suspected paramour. Then we treat the doubt as an actual. The two of them were behind closed doors. Nobody else was there. We don't know what happened. So we treat it as if it was a actual. But if more than two people were there, the law of the Sotah is called off. So when there's more than two people there, and doubt is not considered an actual. And therefore, the same thing is true with the law of impurity. When is impurity? When we're in doubt of impurity. I'm not sure if I touched the impure item or not. I'm not sure what's in doubt. When do I consider that doubt an actual? Only if there is a max of two people there. As soon as there's more than two people, it's, quote, public. Now, the doubt is not considered an actual.
Less than or equal to 2.
Yes.
Equals
less than 2. To be even to Sotah.
Less than 2 or?
2 and lower. Meaning private domain, which in this context is qualified as 2 people maximum. Okay. That's limitation number 1 we took from Sotah. Limitation number 2 we took from Sotah is that when it came to the law of the Sotah, the only time we consider a doubt as an actual is an instance where the people in question are such that we can ask them and they can respond. They might lie, right? Because that's the whole point of this. We don't know if they're lying or not because they're claiming they didn't do anything wrong. And we're not sure because the husband is suspicious. But at least we can talk to them and they can answer. We'll go with Rambam's version to the exclusion of a deaf mute and to the exclusion of someone who's intellectually or emotionally incapable of responding to such questions. Then the same thing happens with the law of the impurity. If there's a doubt, so it's in private, that's the first qualification, and the guy is not sure if he touched impurity, but the guy who's not sure is a deaf mute. He cannot respond to the question. So he fails to, if he were a Sotah, if he were the paramour in the Sotah law, he wouldn't qualify. And therefore here too, his doubt is not considered actual. So if a deaf mute person is not sure if he touched impurity, even if it was in private, that person will not be considered as actually impure because he can't respond to the question. Considering that we learned from the Sotah. This is what we learned already before on 28a.
The qualifications are to the paramour?
Oh, for anybody.
Anybody.
For both. Yeah.
For all parties.
We'll see in a moment. We'll split between the paramour and the woman in a second. But for now, it's for everybody. For anybody. So this is this is what we learned so far on 28a. Now, this is the Gemara Rabbi Gimel was referring to. The Gemara introduces now another derivation to conclude that when it comes to impurity, we require that the person can respond. And what the Gemara is going to do is, the Gemara is going to say that we need both laws. We need the law of the Sotah, and we need their derivation we're bound to introduce, And combined together, we have the full picture of the law. That's what the Gemara is going to tell us.
Both laws meaning one.
Both derivations, one from the Sotah and from the law and from the derivation we're about to introduce. Right? Which is what I was saying then, that the fact that the Gemara introduces now a verse is not a rejection of the law of the Sotah. It's a combination, as we're going to see. And which explains why Rambam, even after the Gemara introduces a verse, still maintained that you derive this law of the necessity to ask the person from Sotah. That's how Rambam phrased it, you'll remember. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Okay, so let's see the derivation from the verses. Amar Rav Gidol Amar Rav. You have it there? You see it there? Amar Rav Gidol Amar Rav. It should be in it. Yeah. Rav Gidol said the name of Rav. Davar. Sheyesh by das lishel. This fact. Of the law that we require someone who can respond to the question in order to turn a doubt into an actual, as well as the ein by das lishel, the fact that if the person is someone we cannot ask and he cannot respond, then we don't consider his doubt as actual. We leave his doubt in doubt and we don't consider it as actual impurity. Says Rav Gidon, name of Rav, Mahaikra Nafka. It can be derived from the following verses. Namely as follows. Bahabasar and flesh, or a human. Let's just say a human. Basar means the human's flesh. Asher yiga b'chol tameh, that shall touch any impurity, lo yoichal, shall not eat. I'm sorry, flesh, I'm sorry, Babasar, any flesh, as in any food. Any food which shall touch something impure should not be eaten. Yeah? One verse. Clear? It's a straight verse. Flesh which touches impurity, don't eat it. The flesh of a carbon or whatever it is. Yeah, it's this week's parsha. Is it this week's parsha? It's Vayikra chapter 7. Is it this week's parsha? Vayikra chapter 7. 1 second. Which parsha is it?
Talk about kosher animals.
Yeah, we also talked about earlier. We talked about the karbanos, right? Before that. Anyway, this week's for sure. Yeah. So the verse says, "Va'basar asher yiga b'chol tamei," any flesh that shall touch any meat that shall touch something impure, lo yochal shall not be eaten. Okay. This is vadai tamei. The verse is describing something that's not a doubt whether untouched, but actual flesh touched impurity. We're certain of it. Hu de lo yochal. That is what you shall not eat. Hasafik, but if you're not sure if it touched, Hasafik tamei, you're not sure if it touched the tamei. Safik tamei, tar, maybe it didn't touch anything impure. What would the verse say? Yochal, eat. Because when the verse says not to eat something that touched impurity, it describes a certainty. This flesh touched impurity. That's when you don't eat. But if in doubt, go ahead and eat. That would be the implication. But, says Rav Gidol, Ema Seifa. But look at the very end of that same verse. That very same verse says, V'habasar kol tar, any flesh that is pure, yoichal shall be eaten. Meaning, basar vadai tar hu de yoichal. Flesh which you are certain is pure, that's what you eat. Basar, the yoichal basar. Hasafik tamei safik tahir. But if you're not sure if it's pure or impure, lo yochal, you shouldn't eat. So the first half of the verse describes definite impurity as not eating. Meaning, if you're not sure, then go ahead and eat. Because it describes not to eat a definite impurity.
Yeah.
The second half of the verse says, eat a definite pure food. But if you're not sure if it's impure or pure, don't eat. So which one is it? So therefore, therefore we must conclude, the verse, this is how Rashi explains the verse. The verse switches from describing the item to describing the person. First it says, meat that shall touch impurity, don't eat. Can you ask a piece of meat what your status is? You can't. And therefore, a piece of meat that you're certain is impure, don't eat. If you're not sure if it's impure or not, you can't ask it, and therefore go ahead and eat. The second half of the verse says, the second half of the verse doesn't describe a piece of meat, but describes the person. A piece of meat that is pure, you shall go ahead and eat. But if you are not sure if it's pure or not pure, you're someone we can ask. And because you're someone we can ask, don't eat. So here it says, we derive already from the verse itself that if you can't ask, you see, here the verse describes an object, which is what led me to conclude that confusion from last week. If you can't ask, then treat it as if, go ahead and eat. Because only if the flesh itself is if the meat itself is definitely impure, that's when you can't eat. But if you're not sure about it, considering that you can't go ahead and ask it, go ahead and eat. But if you as a human are looking at a kosher piece of meat, a pure piece of meat, then you can eat. But if you as a human are looking at a piece and you're not sure of its impurity, you're someone we could ask, and therefore don't eat. So the Gemara concludes. We require the Rav Gidl and Rav. We require both derivations because here, and this is really the proof to my point that we don't reject the Sotah law, because there's something called in Gemara language itzrichasa. Itzrichasa is when you have two derivations or two sources that describe the same thing, and the Gemara says we need them both. When the Gemara says we need them both, what the Gemara is saying is both of these are valid, and without one, you wouldn't have the complete law. Yeah? So now, what? Someone answered it, right? Okay, so leave it. So, which means then, what did Rav Gidl teach us? Rav Gidl taught us not simply the law of the doubt becoming, treating doubt as an actual. But Rav Gidl taught us the specifics that when does a doubt consider as an actual? Only when you can ask the person. That's when you consider doubt as an actual. And on that, the Gemara says we have a tzrichasa, meaning to come to the conclusion that you need to ask someone in order for it to be an actual, we need two different sources to tell us that. The Sotah law and this verse. Namely, the Rav Gidl and Rav, we require the teaching of Rav Gidl and Rav, which derive from the verse, that you must have someone ask. Yeah, you must have someone that's capable of being asked in order to treat the doubt as an actual. And we also require the Sotah law to teach us this very same law, that you need an actual person who's capable of responding in order to treat the doubt as an actual. How is that? Because what the Gemara is going to do is, the Gemara is going to tell us the mistaken conclusion I would have made had I only had one without the other. And that way telling us we need both. Following? If I only had the teaching of Rav Gidl and of Rav, which is these verses, Havamina, I would have concluded that that when is it that I treat the doubt as an actual when I can respond, when the person can respond? These verses that Rav Gidl quoted don't differentiate between public domain and private domain. And then I would say that a person who is in doubt about impurity in public is also impure. That's what I would have concluded, because why not? The verse only distinguishes between someone you can ask, the human, versus something you can't ask, the piece of flesh. That's what the verse distinguished between. But the verse didn't distinguish between private and public, and therefore I would have concluded that I can take the same law and apply it in the public. And therefore it's the Sotah, and therefore I need the Sotah to tell us, no, when is it that I treat the doubt of someone I can ask as an actual when it's only in private, like the Sotah law, which is only in private. Conversely, if I were only to rely on the law of the Sotah to tell me that a doubt of someone I can ask is an actual, if I were only to rely on the Sotah, I would have concluded, you need to be able to ask both the person who is receiving the impurity as well as the one giving the impurity. In the case of the Sotah, you have two parties. In the case of Tumah, impurity, you also have two parties. You have one giver and one receiver. In the case of the Sotah, the paramour is the giver, and he confers by his act. By his act, he confers impurity, the defilement, onto her. By her willingness to engage in that, she is receiving impurity, right? And then the laws apply to her. So in that case, both parties are such that I can ask them what happened. They may lie, they may say we're not sure, but both parties are capable of being asked, both the giver and the receiver. And therefore, I might have concluded that the same thing would be in the law of the Tumah. The law of impurity also has two parties. It has the original party who has the impurity, and then it has the party that receives that impurity from the original party. So maybe if I were to compare it to the law of the Sotah, I would say both parties need to be capable of responding to the question. In other words, it would only be limited to a human who has impurity that's conferring impurity onto another human. That's when I treat the doubt as an actual. But if it's a piece of meat which cannot respond, conferring impurity to a human that could respond, then maybe no. If I were only to learn from the law of the Sotah. And therefore I need the law of the verse, because the verse specifically talks of human touching a piece of meat. Or the human eating a piece of meat, where the piece of meat cannot respond, and it's only the recipient, the human, who's capable of responding. So by combination of these two laws, I come to the proper conclusion, namely like this. Both of these laws tell me that I need to be able to ask the people involved. But the Sotah puts one limitation on that law, and the verses put another limitation on that law. The Sotah puts a limitation on that law that it's only in private. The verses put the limitation on the law, or put an expansion into the law, that it even works when you can only ask one of the parties. But together it creates the full picture that you require the person, or at least one of the people, to be able to respond, which explains why even after the Gemara here introduces this verse, the Gemara doesn't say, forget the earlier Gemara. The Gemara says we need them both. And therefore, even after this Gemara, where the Gemara introduces a verse, Rambam, when he teaches us the law, tells us, look at the Sotah. Following? Yeah.
In the Sotah, you have potentially two parties that can respond.
You do. You do.
You don't need both.
You don't, but if I were to derive the law of impure doubt only from Sotah, not from the verses, then I would have said you have to have both, just like Sotah.
But you don't need both.
You don't need both because the verses describe a human interaction with a piece of meat. This new verse, that's right, because this new verse talks about a human interacting with a piece of meat, and the piece of meat can't respond to you.
Right.
So the verse is clearly saying only one of the two have to be able to respond. Yeah.
And the Sotah comes to teach the other verse that it's private is a doubt.
Oh, that's right. The derivation from Sotah is coming to limit it to only private, not in public. Okay. So we stop over here. God willing, on Monday we get to the next item that was taught on that day when the changing of the leader.